Chapter 63. Leader. The air is cleaner this way, Elaine said, pointing down a dark hall with just as much low-hanging purple mist as any other they'd passed through. Melissa nodded, gesturing to the Precinct 3 forces to follow. The gas hadn't been a problem at first. After a few minutes of walking through it, everyone on the force had prismatic glow. Elaine had warned that he could smell something in the air like Bradburn had given to him. But when nothing happened, they thought they were fine. That lasted until their first shootout with Bradburn guards. Officers Duval, Hogsley, Renedy, Wolsman, and Patterson were all wounded in that fight, which seemed to be just the catalyst the reaction was looking for. If Elaine didn't have Naira's bag of crystals, and the quickness of wit to use her Tarum, they'd have lost all 5 officers to the madness of the transformation. Whether it was a permanent effect like Elaine's was unclear, as leading them away from the areas of higher necrom concentration did seem to be helping. When Elaine had used alchemancy to calm them, the discomforting stretching of their physical features had returned to normal. Melissa hoped that meant it would stay that way. Otherwise, she just poisoned every officer she trusted on the force. They didn't give you another one of those shotguns, did they? Tolson asked beside her. Melissa sighed. They made one for me and one for Leo. And you didn't think to ask them to make one for your good buddy Tolson? She shot him a look of annoyance. You realize that it takes considerable practice with alchemancy to use these things, right? I've almost frozen off a couple of my own fingers using it. Okay, sure. That's a valid point, Tolson said, eyeing the shotgun. Counter-argument. Leo Parsons, avid denier of all things magic, learned to shoot them. At this point, alchemancy saved his life multiple times. He'd be stupid not to use every tool at his disposal. Cool. So when do I get mine? Letting out a groan, Melissa shook her head. They're not mine to make or give out. I will happily accept introductions. Elaine pointed down another hallway, and again Melissa waved her fellow officers forward. Ame's not really the biggest people person. That's perfect, because I am. Oil and water, Tolson. Those will mix if you stir them. She shot him another look, and he amended, sort of. Then he shrugged. Look, all I'm saying is that I just spent the past 2 weeks making sure that Precinct 3 didn't collapse from being without an official chief. You and Leo owe me big time. She couldn't deny that was true. If it wasn't for Tolson, Melissa and Leo would have been fighting this war alone, without any additional police backup. Fine, she said. I promise to personally introduce you to Ame when this is all over. Tolson pumped his fist. Yes! And reintroduce me to Naira so she can teach me alchemancy. Melissa sighed. And Naira. Ahead of them, Elaine's ears perked up at the mention of his wife. Glancing back at them, he gave a soft smile. I think she'd like that. Naira's never happier than when she's teaching someone magic. And I'm never happier than when I'm included in learning magic, Tolson said, folding his arms and shooting Melissa a deliberate look. Rolling her eyes, Melissa took a deep breath of Prism. Look, Tolson, I'm sorry. It's not like we excluded you on purpose. Someone had to hold down the fort. Someone did hold down the fort. And now they're done holding down the fort. So they're going to take a permanent break from holding down the fort and let their friends hold down the fort while they take a much-needed vacation to go learn magic. They locked eyes, and Melissa broke first. Her chuckling caused Tolson to laugh, and his howls rang through the deserted halls. Seed Mother, man. I get it. We neglected you. You'll get your turn with the cool toys soon enough. Tolson's eyes traveled down to the shotgun cradled in her arms. No time like the present? He tried. Don't touch my baby. I can't even hold him? He looks heavy. She, Melissa corrected. She, Tolson said with a flourish, looks like a lovely lady, and I would love to invite her to dance. The sound of distant gunfire reached them, dampening the cheerful mood Tolson always inspired with his presence and antics. He sighed. Guess that dance will have to wait. Afraid so. Orders? He asked. Melissa frowned, turning to him with a raised eyebrow. What the finine are you asking me for? Leo's not here, so you're in charge. Assume my vacation starts today. Someone starts shooting, and now is the time you feel like shirking your duties? You're the senior officer, he countered. Shaking her head, Melissa began counting on her fingers. We have Redson, Foster, and Wigman with us, all of whom have higher rank than me. Only because of your demotion. And because they have experience to back it up. Tolson smirked. But how many of them can recite the articles so well they can keep a baby asleep for an entire night? I have never tried that. Besides, it takes me less than 2 hours to get through all the articles. But that's not the point. With the rules and regulations we have in place, and everything we have on record, I'm not in the position to take charge. You do realize you kind of already did? Tolson said, thumbing over his shoulder. Their entire volunteer force, nearly 100 Precinct 3 officers, stood behind them, ears twitching at the nearby gunshots, and watching Melissa and Tolson for their response. Huffing through her nose, Melissa said, They're following you, genius. And lucky you. I'm bequeathing them to you. Melissa rolled her eyes. Please, you don't even know what that word means. Hurtful, Tolson said, bringing a hand to his rotund chest. According to the rules, I can't take charge, Melissa reiterated. Huh, break the rules. Melissa blinked. Did Tolson just swear? She narrowed her eyes at him. Who are you, and what did you do with my idiot friend Tolson? Tolson sighed. Actually sighed. Something he almost never did, except after finishing a large meal. Melissa, you and I both know you were born for this role. Yes, there's issues in the paperwork, but the reality is, you'd make a better acting chief than me. Seed Mother knows we're both better at it than Leo. So when are you going to own it? Besides, I'm not the only one who sees it. He gestured over his shoulder to the other officers. Officers she'd gotten to know rather well over the last half-decade. She knew them all by name, knew what their family situations were like, how they preferred to spend their evenings, who showed up on time, and who clocked in 5 minutes late every shift. These were people she cared about, more than was comfortable to admit. One of the men at the front, Senior Officer Trilby, spoke up, his gaze bouncing between Tolson and Melissa. We're gonna respond to all that shooting, right? Absolutely, Tolson said. Right, Chief? He thumped her on the arm. Chief. The dream she'd given up. The one thing she'd assumed she couldn't have for years to come. The weight and responsibility of the position was daunting. But Fanina, she couldn't deny that she still wanted it. Her fingers tightened on her shotgun, and she took a deep breath. Pulling down the mask, she turned to Precinct 3. Listen up! We're in a situation with way too many active shooters. There's still plenty of civilians in this stadium, and the 13's forces are currently tearing each other apart. I don't need to remind you that we're here to save lives. So ID your targets before you fire. You see someone in Renetta gear in your sights, you hold your fire. If I catch wind of any friendly fire, I'll strip your pelt and hang it next to Bradburn's trophies in the chief's office. If Bradburn's people shoot at you, you shoot back with intent to kill. I don't want any more dead or wounded officers. You get injured, you fall back. If you can get to a lane, have him check you. I don't want us becoming liabilities to each other. If Bradburn's people surrender, take them in peaceably, but don't give them a chance to change their minds. Most of all, watch each other's backs out there, because we're all we've got. We all swore oaths to serve and protect this city, so let's see it done. Not thinking of anything further to say, Melissa turned and started walking, renewed purpose in her stride. Much to her relief, the rest of the officers followed her almost immediately. Tolson strode up beside her. Told you. You're a natural. They reached a set of double doors, screams and gunshots echoing through. Elaine was pressed up against the doors, sniffing at the gap between them. Mostly Sneppards, though there's a few that smell like me. Like death. Great. Giving him a nod, she said, Once we're inside, find cover. Naira will kill me if I let anything happen to you. Elaine shrugged by way of agreement, and Melissa and the rest of Precinct 3 stacked up at the door. On my mark, Melissa said, giving her people time to ready themselves. Pulling the mask back up, she took a deep breath and gave the signal. Chapter 64. Bodyguard. Much like Rolf had feared, the gas had started to change people. Anyone who got hurt while breathing it in quickly turned into a ravenous animal, attacking anyone and everyone around them. It affected both sides indiscriminately, and only served to increase losses for everyone. That had been bad enough. Then the real monsters had shown up. Bradburn himself, and a small collection of his guards. Hot on their heels, a trio of Nolfin anima spawn. Actual, living natives. What set these apart from the others wasn't their prismatic glow. Everyone and their mother had glowing eyes in this stadium by now. What set them apart was their ability to tap into the terum Rolf could smell in the air. Like the other anima spawn, these were tearing indiscriminately into anyone with a weapon, but they were far larger than the rest, and with their ability to tap into magic, far deadlier. Vines materialized in the air, constricting troops on both sides, choking them and leaving them vulnerable to tooth and claw. Yet, despite the fervor with which they attacked any of their targets, it was impossible to miss that they were plowing a path straight for Bradburn. Rolf watched all of this from the window of the conference room, practically bouncing in place beside Madame D, who watched on in horror. Brunetta pointed. Look at the ones nearest him. They seem different. Focused, but just as lethal. She was right. The clump of guards immediately surrounding Bradburn was about as effective at hiding him as surrounding a squash with tomatoes, but anything that got too close was immediately and permanently put down. Most of Renetta's remaining forces had retreated back into the conference room, along with the few survivors among the 13 and their staff. Those who remained outside were putting up one fanina of a fight, but it was obvious they were going to lose. Even with the natives chomping on Bradburn's heels, it wouldn't be in time. Every fiber of his being wanted to go bursting out that door and to join the fray. People were dying on both sides while he watched from a window. But that wasn't his task. His task was too important. There was one person he needed to keep alive at any cost. Outside, one of the natives swept a group of troops aside in a tangle of thorny vines, putting the native within arm's reach of Bradburn. Look! They're about to get Bradburn! Someone in the room shouted, drawing an eager crowd to the window. People cheered as the monster grabbed Bradburn by the throat and lifted him into the air. It had to keep one arm under the ground to balance, but the feat of strength was still incredible. Before Bradburn's men could intervene, Bradburn himself pulled a gun from his coat. It was an odd design, made out of a metal that shone far too orange in the Fyram torchlight outside. Vines materialized at his side, crawling along his arm, but he overpowered them and shot the native in the head. Immediately, the vines disintegrated into green mist, and the creature stumbled backwards. Bradburn drew a different gun with his other hand, firing 3 rounds into the native's skull. It collapsed, and a hush fell over the conference room. Bradburn reloaded the special gun from the back, then fired on another one of the natives. Again, the creature recoiled as it took the round, and the swath of vines stemming from it crumbled into dust. Bradburn's troops fired on this one, filling it with bullets until it lay motionless on the ground. The last native let out a roar, sweeping its arms in a motion that spawned over a dozen vines. They shot out of the ground, tips sharpened like spears, and skewered well over half the forces Bradburn had left. Thorns burst from the vines as they wrapped and curled and punctured again and again. The native's eyes glowed with prismatic intensity Rolf had never seen, even from someone like Mrs. N. The glow lasted until Bradburn shot the native with that special gun. The glow faded. The vines disintegrated. The shooting began, and the final native collapsed among the bodies of the people it had just killed. All that remained standing outside was Bradburn and 6 of his men. These went about meticulously finishing off the wounded on all sides. Then they turned at Bradburn's order and fired on the windows to the conference room. The glass ran from one wall to the other, from floor to ceiling. It was decorative, not structural, and it shattered almost immediately. Bradburn's beefed-up soldiers rushed forward. Renetta's men stepped up to intercept them, and the room devolved into chaos. "Take the ministers alive!" Bradburn bellowed, his voice carrying over the din of the brawl. "Kill everyone else." Like Fanina. Putting Madame D behind him, Rolf pulled her towards the wall. One of Bradburn's men saw him and rushed in. The man swung with a knife, a combat blade as wide as 3 fingers. The magnets in Rolf's suit messed with the swing, and the knife collided with his armored forearm, sticking fast with a loud clang. As with most people, his attacker was caught off guard by this, and Rolf used the moment of confusion to his advantage. A swift uppercut, an elbow across the jaw, and a straight jab to the throat. With effort, Rolf resisted the urge to headbutt again. He was pretty sure he knew how he'd screwed it up last time, but it'd be stupid to risk yet another concussion right now. Rolf had landed solid hits with metal-plated gloves. Still, the man hardly looked dazed, eyes glowing vibrantly with murder. More than a little freaked out, Rolf reached out and grabbed the man's shoulder, activating a pulse of electrum that should have dropped him. The man spasmed in his grip, but just grinned when Rolf let off the throttle. What the Fanina? The man delivered 2 quick hits to Rolf's gut. Not expecting them, Rolf took them both without preparation. Then the man was pivoting, spinning into Rolf's body and throwing him over his shoulder. Weeks of practice kicked in, and Rolf slammed the ground with his arm right as his body made contact. It was the only thing that saved him from having the wind knocked out of him. He kind of needed that wind to breathe. Realizing he wasn't getting his knife free anytime soon, the man crouched down and drove his fist straight for Rolf's face. Rolf rolled out of the way, and the man's fist connected with the concrete so hard, Rolf heard something crack. The concrete was fine. The guy's hand? The 2 central knuckles had stoved in, which was definitely not how a hand was supposed to look. Yet, despite that, the guy still grinned like a loon. Seed Mother, what kind of murderous psychos did Bradburn employ? Getting to his feet, Rolf took up a defensive stance. They fell into a boxing match, trading blows until Rolf finally trapped an arm. Not wanting to take chances, Rolf ran electrum through the man until froth ran from his lips. It cost him the rest of the battery, but when he released the man to the ground, he didn't get up again. "Renetta Dolahan, you utterly infuriating and unkillable woman," Bradburn called as he stepped into the room. Spinning on his heels, Rolf put himself between the enormous Sneppard and Madame D. This guy wasn't Tigra-sized, but Seed Mother, he was still a giant in his own right. He was several inches taller than Rolf, which was saying something, and easily twice his mass. It was going to take a lot of electrum to fry this cat. Man, he wished Tigra had been able to stay behind for this. "You're finished, Bradburn," Madame D snapped. "All of this death! And for what?" Bradburn snorted. "A better future, obviously." Standing not 2 feet from Rolf was the man who'd killed the closest thing Rolf had to a mother. Being a rescue herself, Forohana had often taken in strays that the orphanages kicked onto the streets. Rolf and Naomi were 2 of those strays. Forohana had raised close to 24 over the years, until this man put a bullet in her head and in the heads of her husband and 4 of Rolf's siblings. If ever there was a reason to deck a guy in the face, that was it. So that's exactly what Rolf did. There was a satisfying crunch as Rolf's fist collided with Bradburn's nose. Bradburn's smug, confident expression melted into murderous fury. Rolf threw a second punch, but Bradburn batted it away before popping Rolf in the jaw. As expected, it hurt quite a bit to be punched by a fist almost as large as your face. Rolf wasn't given time to worry if his jaw had been dislocated, because Bradburn's hand drifted towards his coat, no doubt going for a gun. No way Rolf was letting that happen. He threw himself at Bradburn, digging his fingers into the man's blood-stained shirt and tapping into the electrum battery he still had. Bradburn stiffened as electricity jumped into his body from Rolf's suit. Despite the way his muscles contracted, his whole body visibly clenching, his eyes remained fixed on Rolf. They burned with hatred and disgust. This was a man who would kill Rolf given the opportunity. With a chill, Rolf realized there was nothing he could do to change that. It sucked to be likable and encounter someone who had never met you, yet still made up their mind to hate you. Bradburn's own weight started to pull him backwards, reducing his contact with Rolf. Before Rolf could readjust, Bradburn smacked his hand aside, grabbed him by the shoulders, pulled him in, and smashed Rolf's forehead with his own. Ow! Really? Seed Mother, he'd just treated himself for a possible concussion. Rolf blinked against the sudden swarm of fireflies filling his vision. Fanina, his head pounded. With some dismay, he saw that Bradburn seemed fine. If he was in pain, the monster certainly didn't show it. Why did everyone else get to do the cool moves and be fine? Did Rolf just need to drink more milk? Bang his head against a wall 100 times a day to build up resistance? Dross, that hurt. That all you got? Rolf tried to say. Bring it on! Instead, his words slurred, and what came out was something closer to, Is that all you got? Bring it on! Despite his blurred vision and dizziness, Rolf threw an electrified jab at Bradburn's chest. Catching his arm, Bradburn redirected the blow, driving Rolf's hand back at his own exposed throat. The pressure was enough to activate the thumb button, and electrum flowed freely into Rolf's body. His grip tightened automatically as every muscle in his body contracted. Great. Now he was electrocuting and strangling himself at the same time. Someone else might enjoy that, but it was Fanina for Rolf. He'd been on the receiving end of electrum before, through electrum batons and a couple of the practice sessions in Ame's backyard, but this was a whole nother level. She'd warned him, The stuff I'm equipping you with is lethal. Treat it as such. Rolf couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Even if he wasn't choking himself, his lungs weren't responding like they should. He tried to focus on his fingers, to loosen their grip and cut off the electrum. They weren't listening either. What a terrible and unheroic way to go out. Battered by a headbutt, then electrocuted with your own materials. What a load of deerhound dross. Rolf couldn't tell how much electrum was left in the battery. Too much. It refused to run out. His vision blurred even further, and he only barely registered from his periphery when Bradburn stepped around him. The world was fire in his nerves and veins, and his fingers were clenched so hard they felt ready to snap. As the seconds stretched into years, it seemed this torment would never end. Then Rolf collapsed, and the world went black. Chapter 65. Lullaby. Out on an open rooftop in the middle of a vigorous thunderstorm was the last place Moira would have expected to be thirsty. She was up to her eyeballs in water, and all she wanted was a drink. Okay, she was only up to her ankles in water, but she was soaked through and through like a mop left in a bucket of water for weeks. At a certain point of being wet, you stopped noticing or caring. She'd reached that point hours ago. Okay, so that was an exaggeration too, as she hadn't been up here that long. But as the minutes stretched on with no one but herself to keep her company, the minutes might as well have been hours. First, she'd sung to the point of getting a parched throat. Then, she'd combined that with running around at full speed and maximum effort to survive her fight with Tazael. Her chest and throat had both burned after that, and no amount of catching rain in her mouth had helped. The raindrops were as helpful for bringing relief to her throat as a finger bandage was helpful to stop the bleeding from an amputation. It was a nice thought, but fell so far short of what she needed right now. Even now, as she took out an aquam crystal to put in her cassette player, she wondered if she could pull any off for drinking. As strong a reaction as the high-grade stuff produced, she didn't dare risk it. The last thing she wanted was to freeze her tongue off or accidentally plug up her throat and stomach with ice. So, taking an extended moment to catch a few more drops of rain on her tongue, she replaced her mask with a sigh and started to sing. Her voice ached, but thankfully the megaphone portion of her mask still worked. Miracle it had survived when Tazael had overloaded the speakers in the ears, but Moira wasn't about to complain. She needed to sing quietly for a little while. Pressing play, she got to work. The metal body of the pump grew cold beneath her hands, frosting up despite the constant deluge. Without tools or the muscles to brute force her way in, She was trying more creative methods to break into the pumps. The metal bent and warped as she shaped it, making room as she filled any gap she could find with ice. Eventually, several of the screws stripped out and the outer casing popped loose. Moira gripped the metal, and her wet gloves stuck to the frozen surface. She panicked, briefly, worried that she was going to give herself frostbite, but the rain was warm enough to counteract this effect a few moments later. She wasn't quite tall enough to lift the cover free, so she had to throw the end she'd grabbed, giving it enough momentum to not snag at the top. The crash it made as it landed in the gravel was drowned out by a fresh peal of thunder. Now that the inside of the pump was exposed, she heard the distinct songs of 3 separate reactions: Necrum, Terrum, and Aurum. Unlike the pump for the concert, there was something discordant in the Necrum song she heard from this pump and its neighbors. A sinister note hiding behind the normal melody, like a tuba trying to hide among clarinets. When you heard it, you knew it didn't belong. These reactions came from a series of hoppers inside the pump, each holding an entire pile of their respective crystals. The hoppers fed individual augers 1 or 2 crystals at a time, which fed them down the line until they fell into some kind of grinder with interlocking gears that crushed the crystals into powder. Rather than feed these poison machines with a giant crystal like she'd originally imagined, he'd actually gone the safe route and opted to achieve the same effect with hundreds of small crystals. Once the reaction started, a fan blew the resultant gas out of the pump and into the vents. Now that she'd exposed the cover, the reaction was dissipating into the open air around her. She briefly considered scooping out what remained of the Necrum, but the visual of getting her hand trapped by an active auger was more than enough discouragement. Moira had 4 batteries left at this point: 1 Aurum, 1 Aquam, 1 Terrum, and 1 Curum. As far as she knew, she was the only one in the squad who'd brought along a Curum battery. Everyone else opted for a handful of crystals. At this point, she was basically the team medic, so it made sense to her to bring both. Well, it wasn't going to do her any good at the moment, so she loaded up the Aurum and Aquam in her suit. Then with a breath of Prism, she started backflooding the Necrum feed on the pump with ice. She tried not to think about how the little ice crystals sparkled and shone, because that only reminded her that Phanatom's air was actively diffusing into the bulb far overhead. One problem at a time. Something inside the auger gave a loud pop and ground to a halt. It was so plugged with ice, the metal had bulged outwards. Now, only Aurum and Terrum fed into the grinder. She breathed out a sigh of relief. That left her with only 10 more pumps. Stupid bracking Tazael. Why do you have to be so stupid and so thorough? He'd gotten his mother's stubborn drive and none of her common sense or intelligence, and now he'd left one fanina of a mess for Moira to clean up. Literally. She glanced up at the distant, ginormous hole in the dome and shook her head. Seed Mother, Tazael was insane. Grimly, she trudged through the rain to the next pump in the line. No sooner had she started wedging it open with ice than she heard the crunch of gravel behind her. She spun, arms raised and ready to unleash frigid blasts on her would-be assailants. To her great relief, it wasn't Tazael, nor was it anyone in Bradburn attire. It was a massive Nulf in what used to be a well-pressed, but was now a well-drenched suit. I know I'm not Master Tigra, but I came as soon as I could, Miss Moira. She hugged him immediately, throwing her arms around his waist, further removing any dry spots on his clothing. Sergei returned the hug. I'm glad to see you are safe, Miss Moira. The stadium has devolved into pandemonium. I was worried it might have reached you already. Moira shook her head, gesturing back to the pumps. If it's chaos down there, I'm pretty sure these are the cause. I broke one already, but there's a bunch left to go. Well, as always, my hands are at your service, Miss Moira. How might I help you save the day? If there was ever proof that Seed Mother cared, it was that Moira had been given a friend like Sergei. He'd have made an incredible father. I'm going to use ice to bust this thing open, but I could use help lifting the cover off. There's screws holding it on, but I don't have anything to work those loose, so I've been brute forcing it. Don't suppose you happen to pack any screwdrivers or electrum drills? He smiled with a genuineness that had never quite been beaten out of him by the state of the world. I'm afraid I brought no power tools. I have the keys to your car, my identification, and a personal sidearm Marston insisted I take. So, as I said, at best, I can offer my hands. She nodded, her attention returning to the pump while her voice attuned to Aquam. Once the cover had been loosed, Sergei stepped in to lift it away. Careful, Moira warned. It's going to be super cold. She trailed off as Sergei ignored the warning and quickly hoisted it over. It crashed to the gravel, and he rubbed his hands vigorously for a few moments, then stuck them under his armpits. I tried to tell you. He smiled and shook his head. I'll be fine, Miss Moira. Now that the internals were exposed, she explained how the pumps worked as she set about using ice to sabotage the Necrom feed. Sergei watched dutifully, adding a couple comments of his own. All right, 9 pumps left. Woof. While she started on the next pump, Sergei circled it, the way her mother circled her after dressing her for some seed mother awful formal event. It was also the way Moira used to loiter around the hovercar while Sergei made repairs. She doubted she'd been of much help to him or paid enough attention to do it herself in the future, but it had been a great opportunity for talking after her dad passed. It'd been good for both of them. On his second pass, Sergei reached out and flicked something. What'd you do? Moira asked. He shrugged. I've a hunch these external switches power the individual feeds. External switches? Moira stopped with her Aquam long enough to come look. Sure enough, there was a small panel near the bottom, lined with a series of little metal toggle switches. She'd been in such a hurry to tear these things apart, she'd missed that. Stupid. They were much more careful in removing the cover this time, doing their best not to disconnect any wires. As he'd predicted, the Necrom auger sat motionless, despite still having half a hopper of crystals. How'd you know? Moira asked, relieved she wouldn't have to waste more Aquam on the pump. Sergei used a long, dripping finger to trace a thin wire running from the auger's motor out to the switch on the cover. Moira sighed. She really needed to stop doing everything in such a hurry. With his new discovery under their belts, shutting down the pumps was child's play. They toggled each pump's Necrom feed in turn, but left the Terram and Aurum running. If the scene below was as bad as Sergei had described, then the whole place could stand to calm down. Tazael really must not have expected company on the roof if these things were that easy to turn on and off. Stupid, overconfident, frustrating man. Thanks Seed Mother he didn't have his mother's foresight. Content that they'd done what they could for the bulk of the stadium, Moira and Sergei returned to the pump feeding the concert. This was the first one Moira had tried sabotaging, and the one that had spurred Tazael to attack her. Like the others, this one had a series of switches, including one labeled Rin's Gift. Her Aquam battery was depleted by now. She could try her stunt with the rain again, but didn't want to risk accidentally freezing herself or Sergei, so she opted to use one of her cassette crystals instead. When combined with Sergei's strength, it was enough to pry the cover open. Inside was the same hopper situation as the other pumps, but centered between them was the largest Terram crystal Moira had ever seen. It bulged like a well-fed toddler. In the top of the green crystal had been carved the words, "To help them see." It was otherwise unblemished. Sergei let out a low whistle, one nearly lost to another clap of thunder. That's one of the safe ones, right? Moira nodded. How much of a crowd could you affect with a Terram crystal of this size? There was a loud pop of Aurum that Moira almost mistook for more thunder, until she heard the resounding cheer. She and Sergei both looked to the side as the world's largest flying mammal rose into the sky. Tigra had finally arrived. He soared up from the open central field of the stadium, riding a burst of Aurum so voluminous and loud, Moira could hear its song over the steady rain. Tigra circled above them, eyes glowing, grin gleaming. Then, having spotted them, he glided in for a landing. Tigra has never known such freedom, the big man bellowed. First, the ground was his, but now, so too is the sky. It was impossible not to share in his joy, and Moira didn't bother to hide her smile. Shaking off excess water, as if that would make any difference in this deluge, Tigra planted his fists on his hips like a comic book hero. Tigra is come to help Moira, and bring much aurum. Moira's smile settled into a grimace as she remembered the reason she'd called for him to come find her. She was about to ask the impossible. Her gaze drifted back to Rin's gift. Maybe it wasn't fully impossible. She had a choice to make now. Dazale had clearly intended that crystal for the concert. As large as it was, there was a chance it could affect the whole stadium. There were a lot of people inside that could stand to calm down. Tarim had helped Dazale and Naomi and Moira calm down long enough for conversation before. With this many important people fighting in one place, something like that could go a long way towards bettering the future for everyone. Even so, there was a much bigger problem. A much larger stadium to consider, with millions of lives on the line. A problem that Moira shouldn't have to fix, certainly had no credentials to fix, and yet couldn't ignore. Brack. How many stupid plans was she going to have in one night? And how long before one of those plans didn't work? No. If it worked for Naira, then it would work for her. Fanina, if it worked for that numbskull Dazale to leap without looking, then Moira could trust her gut too. Sergei, she said, gesturing at the pump, I'm going to need that Tarim crystal. On it, was his instant reply as he set to work prying it loose. Bracing herself to be shot down, Moira turned to Tigra. Just how high will that suit let you fly? Chapter 66. Ren. I said move! Bradburn's second-in-command snapped, punctuating his order by jabbing the barrel of his rifle into Renetta's spine, right between the shoulders. She stumbled forward, dress shoes nearly slipping in the mud, as she and the rest of the surviving 13 were marched out onto the playing field. There weren't many left. Only herself, Edelston, the Minister of Transportation, Prowler, the Minister of Infrastructure, and Bradburn, the usurper minister, were still alive. Genley and Downing, the ministers of Immigration and Trade, had both been killed. Genley during the initial firefight, and Downing by one of the anima-spawn monsters. As far as personnel, Prowler had a few aides still remaining, as did Edelston. All their personal security had been shot. Renetta had lost everyone that had been assigned to guard her, even little Rolf. He'd tried, Seed Mother bless him, but Bradburn had left him convulsing on the floor. Renetta prayed he'd survived, but she'd been marched from the room at gunpoint and had no way of knowing. The only silver lining was that Bradburn had suffered losses in equal measure. There were 5 armed men with him, all showing evidence of various injuries. Even more encouraging was the fact that none of them had bothered to search her. She was a female in politics. What could she possibly be hiding? The compact handgun held 6 rounds, and it rested in a small holster sewn into the lining of her coat. And thanks to their own naive assumptions, none of these people knew she was armed. Thanks Seed Mother for Marston's paranoia. 6 rounds wasn't many, and she had little practice with the gun, but get a target close enough and it wouldn't matter. She didn't have to be a sharpshooter like the detectives. She just needed the right opportunity. Bradburn didn't march them far, stopping just shy of home plate and removing his gas mask. He tested the air, then growled. That's far enough. He blinked against the rain, staring back at the poison-filled halls of the stadium before shaking his head. I'm gonna murder that Kit. Renetta had no idea which Kit he was referring to, as Bradburn seemed all too willing to murder anyone who even slightly inconvenienced him. He better not be talking about her daughter. Line them up, he ordered, taking several steps towards the pitcher's mound. He began pacing, carving a new creek in the mud. The rifle invaded Renetta's space again, forcing her to line up with the other hostages, like they were about to be chosen to fill teams for baseball. On their knees, hands on their heads, Bradburn ordered again, barely watching them as his pacing picked up in speed. Sorry. Everyone in line looked at each other. Prowler, Minister of Infrastructure, voiced his concerns about getting mud on his dry cleaning, only to receive a rifle butt to the gut. A stiff hand clamped onto his shoulder and forced him to his knees. No one else spoke up after that, and it wasn't long before everyone else's knees were marinating in mud. Renetta laced her fingers loosely behind her ears, resting it against her hair. It was losing its texture and form under all this water, which meant the dye might be washing out too. An hour of work this morning down the drain. "End of the line, gentlemen," Bradburn announced, facing his captive audience with a sour expression. "End of a dynasty, really. Or a tyranny. Or an era. Call it whatever you want. The 13 die today, and Cyphus will be reborn from their ashes. I tried playing by your rules, but no one was cooperating. So now, we play by mine." His lips curled down, like the water running through his cheeks was pulling them. What idiot thought that rule by the rich was the best thing for Cyphus anyway? He gestured to Edelston and Prowler. "Your families have held seats on the 13 since the very beginning. Disgusting. That's not representation. That's not leadership. This city's forgotten what it means to have a leader. What we can do when we have direction and a common goal. I'm going to give them all 3. Renetta let out a laugh. She'd never been thrilled with the established Cyphus bureaucracy. It was a system that promoted corruption, buyouts, and interbreeding. Still, she'd played by the rules and gotten to the point where she was starting to make a difference. To abolish the system entirely, though? Madness. Bradburn glared at her. "Something to say, Dolahan?" "Your idea of fixing the system is to destroy it, then build your own throne upon the ashes?" She glanced at him, her lips twisting in a wry smirk. "You really believe the people of Cyphus are going to follow someone who upends their comfortable lives? You're not waking them up with an alarm. You're setting off a bomb in their neighborhoods and expecting them to thank you for it." "Shut her up," Bradburn hissed, "before I shoot her." The same man who'd pushed her around earlier strode forward and drove his fist into her jaw. Renetta's cheek flared with pain, the bones of her mouth aching, though thankfully it felt like she still had all her teeth. "I make this offer once," Bradburn continued, intentionally ignoring Renetta. "Tonight, I become Grand Administrator of Cyphus. I alone have what it takes to protect this city, and the power to enforce that protection. You can either endorse me and find new ways to be useful to Cyphus under me, or I put a bullet in your head and bring about change without you." He still needs us, Renetta realized. Otherwise, he'd have ordered his men to gun us down and be done with it. "He wants one of the 13 to vouch for him," she said, loud enough for her fellow hostages to hear. "He needs one of us to publicly endorse him so the city accepts his takeover." "I only need one," he snarled, "which means someone like you." Bradburn walked up to one of Prowler's aides, a middle-aged sneppard, shivering despite the warmth of the rain. "Is of no use to me." "Don't!" Renetta called. Her words fell on uncaring ears. Bradburn shot the aide in the head. The man collapsed, his blood flowing freely into the mud. The other hostages let out a variety of reactions. Some screams of terror, others cries of indignation. Renetta stared at the dead aide, her claws flexing on their own as anger warmed her veins. "Shut up!" Bradburn bellowed. "I'm losing my patience with all of you." He swept the gun down the line. "I only need one. Who's it gonna be? Or am I gonna have to encourage someone to volunteer?" Prowler spoke up, though his voice was shaky. "What kind of endorsement do you want? Are you looking for monetary support, or just a statement?" She'd known Prowler was fairly spineless. Now he proved himself a Mueller. "Excellent question," Bradburn said, beginning to pace again. "All of the above, frankly. Money and political support are both of interest to me. Edelston, you have a counteroffer?" Unlike the young Prowler, Edelston had dealt with his fair share of political bullies. He met Bradburn's glare of disdain with an even gaze. "Fine," Bradburn said, as calm as a parent that intended to end the blame game between two children by punishing them both. With barely even a blink, Bradburn turned his gun on one of Edelston's aides and fired. The woman splashed back into the mud, and more people screamed. Not much of an offer. Perhaps the next one will be better, Bradburn continued, walking back up the line. Prowler, anything to further earn my vote? Don't play his game, Prowler, Renetta called. He can't afford to touch us if none of us cooperate. Bradburn sighed, his ears flicking against the falling rain. I'm really not sure how to make it any clearer that I'm well versed in the art of convincing people to cooperate. No sooner had he finished speaking than he shot another of Prowler's aides. The sneppard sank into the mud, and Bradburn leveled a finger at Renetta. His death is on you, Dolahan. The longer you refuse to cooperate, the more people die. Then his gaze turned to his second-in-command. Thought I told you to shut her up. Again, the man stepped forward. Only this time, when he hit her, he used the butt of his rifle. Renetta was thrown onto her side, fingers sinking into the mud, blood dripping from her lips. The guard hovered over her, rifle aimed at her, his eyes begging for a reason to shoot. There's 4 more of your little helpers before I'm forced to start shooting people that matter. I know where Dolahan stands, but can your consciences bear that weight, gentlemen? A growl lodged itself painfully in Renetta's throat. She couldn't just sit here and let people die. Prowler looked eager to grovel, but Edelston? The man was almost 20 years Renetta's senior, and he'd dealt with a lot of nonsense in his time among the 13. He and Renetta didn't always see eye to eye, but they respected each other, which was more than she'd ever gotten from any of the other entrenched members. Edelston gave her a look, one that said his conscience couldn't bear it any more than hers could. Hold your fire, he snapped. With a casual air, Bradburn clasped his hands in front of him, gun still prominently on display. Something you'd like to say, Minister? Stop with the needless killing. You've made your point. Finally, Bradburn said, shaking his head. It's absurd what it takes to make you people see reason. It's no wonder the 13 never get anything useful done. Gentlemen, it seems we found our volunteer. What about me? Prowler stammered, eyes wide and blinking rapidly against the raindrops splashing off his own muzzle. I don't trust people who want to bury their nose in my rump because they think it's what I want. Besides, I don't need you alive to receive your monetary aid. With a swirl of his finger, Bradburn leveled it like a gun at Prowler. Bradburn's men snapped to and opened fire, mowing down Prowler and his aides. The guard standing over Renetta was distracted, so she lunged for the knife at his belt, drawing it out and plunging it into his thigh. Before he could respond, she buried it up to the hilt in his armpit. He tried to pivot his rifle to shoot her, but she caught his wrist with her claws, raking through until she scraped bone. The wounds were deep, gushing blood, but the guard seemed unfazed as he drove his rifle butt into Renetta's face. Again, she found herself on her knees in the mud. She refused to stay there. The guard stepped forward, bringing the rifle inches from her head. Her hand shot out, catching the barrel and lifting it away as he opened fire. It only took a few seconds of continuous shooting for the barrel to get hot enough to burn her hand, a burn only mildly tempered by the rain. Her other hand found his throat. Her claws sank in, and she tore away with every ounce of strength she had. The man stared at her like nothing had happened. Even as blood spilled so freely from his neck, the fur there looked naturally red. He took 2 steps forward, then collapsed, seeming to feel nothing as his life drained away. Bradburn himself walked towards Renetta, tapping the gun against his thigh. Renetta Dolahan, I've wanted you dead for a while. I've known that as long as you're alive, you will be a thorn in my side. None of my efforts to see you killed have borne any fruit. He shook his head, a scowl of complete disdain spreading across his face. If you want something done right. Then he raised the gun. Renetta dove for the fallen guard's rifle, only for a boot to smash down on her fingers. Seed Mother, you're stubborn, Bradburn hissed. No wonder you've been so impossible to kill. Beside her, Edelston and his aides leapt to their feet, charging at Bradburn's men. It was a desperate ploy, one doomed to fail if Bradburn didn't fall. Bradburn's head whipped to the side, and he swore, turning his gun on Edelston. Never another opportunity like this. Using her free hand, Renetta's fingers worked into her jacket, found the gun, and pulled it free. Squinting against the rain, she fired off 3 shots into Bradburn's side. He lowered his gun long enough to turn and look down at her. Then he shook his head in disappointment. "You should have gone for the head," he muttered. No blood ran from his side. Black fabric showed through the bullet holes she'd made. He was wearing a bulletproof vest. She readjusted for his head, but Bradburn was faster, his bullet catching her in the shoulder and causing her to drop her gun. He pressed his own directly against her forehead, the hot barrel searing a circle above her eyes. No escape this time. She stared up into the eyes of a murderer, the blood of his man still staining her claws. She'd done it for survival, but that would still stay with her in a way that Bradburn could never experience. Killing me won't kill what I represent, Bradburn. The noose is closing. You're not making it out of this with what you want. He snorted. What I want most right now is you, dead at my feet. The world behind Bradburn exploded in orange as a fireball collided with the back of his head. It impacted with such force that Renetta was knocked over as he stumbled forward. The next swath of fire engulfed the struggle between Bradburn's men and Edelston's aides, burning indiscriminately. Bradburn spun to fire, but more flame erupted in his face. Its source? A young Nolfin male in a green and white Letterman jacket. A young man with notched ears and prismatic fire in his eyes. A man who looked every bit like his mother, Naira. His eyes held the same murderous intent as Bradburn's, and he cracked another crystal. The very air around Bradburn was filling with steam at the intensity of the flames. Tazael said nothing, simply kept up the torrent of fire, alternating between Bradburn and his men as he walked closer. His intentions were clear. He wasn't here for justice or to defend anyone. He was here for vengeance, and he would see them all burn. Chapter 67. Naturalist. Moira clung tight as Tigra fired off another Aurum crystal from his cannon. The wind magic flung them upwards like a bullet fired from a gun. They were thousands of feet in the air, well above the rooftops of even the bulb's most prestigious skyscrapers. The spire was so close, Moira could feel her fur standing on end. Seed Mother, please don't let them get struck by lightning. The spire narrowed as they continued to climb, the hole stretching overhead like a broken mirror the size of a city block. As their momentum slowed, Tigra fired again, and they were launched through the hole and out into the open air. The view was breathtaking. Lush jungle as far as the eye could see, leaves shimmering as moonlight danced through the prism in the air. The trees were enormous. While the Siphus bulb beneath them had a 20-mile footprint, and its dome rose thousands of feet into the sky, some of the trees in the distance were taller still. Birds shone with vibrant bioluminescent glows all their own as they weaved through the distant trees, roosting in branches that curled and interlaced like tarum vines. Gigantic as those trees were, the birds were probably large enough that they could gobble up Tigra and Moira as easily as Moira might eat a couple raisins. The sense of scale was mind-boggling. From up here, the bulb looked like a blackhead on the land, a glass zit in an otherwise world of lush green. Black spread out in a circle from the dome for hundreds and hundreds of feet, and the tree line of the jungle came to an abrupt halt over a mile away. Never before had it been quite so obvious to Moira that they were interlopers. It was taught in the schools, but it was easy to forget when the world that enveloped you was only glass and concrete and metal. The black and white pictures in their textbooks didn't do it justice. They couldn't possibly capture the life that spread out before Moira. People said that Fanatom was a hostile environment. To little people like her, it probably was. That didn't make it any less beautiful. It was almost painful to see the effect Siphus had on the land around it, even if it was just a tiny black dot in an entire canvas of greens and browns and life. As their momentum faded, Tigra opened his arms, wind catching in the folds of his suit as he began gliding back down. "How are we going to break the crystal?" Moira called out over the rush of wind. "Give crystal," was the only response. Coming from anyone but Tigra, the lack of communication would have rubbed Moira's fur the wrong way. He wasn't the typical adult trying to withhold things from her because of her age. He just didn't use a lot of words. No sooner had she passed him the large Tarim crystal than Tigra dipped into a dive. The bulb rushed towards them, and he wielded the crystal like a bat, smashing it against glass as thick as Moira's torso. A large chunk of the crystal's tip smashed off, and it hemorrhaged Tarim. I need it as close as you can get to the spire. If she didn't have the megaphone in her mask, she'd have needed to yell at volumes her already strained voice was in no condition to produce. As it was, she could speak at a comfortable volume while Electrum still hummed in her mask. Thank Seed Mother that Ame and Naira were so good at planning. I do not wish to hug lightning, Tigra said, but I will get it close. He swooped in, and again Moira could feel her rain-slicked fur starting to stand on end. Pulling up into a standing position, Tigra wound up and tossed the crystal like a javelin. Gravity began tugging him back towards the ground, and his attention returned to creating and writing Aurum currents. Moira put everything she had into Tarim's song. Vines as large as her whole body erupted from the crystal, budding with vibrantly colored flowers like the spots on her tail. The vines lashed themselves to the spire, glowing green with an intensity to match Fyrum lighting. The vines wrapped and spread and grew with hundreds, no, thousands of tendrils spreading out in all directions, fingers grasping for something or someone to hold. She begged the vines to search outside the hole, and only a few stubbornly stayed inside the dome. The others spread out, fingertips finally reaching glass, then exploring it. The green grew and spread like the spire was a coat rack, and the Tarim was Cypher's own straw hat. It formed a mat of such thickly interwoven vines, Moira could no longer see the stars overhead. Her whole body trembled with relief as she let her song trail off. The Tarim would continue on its own for a while. Her crazy plan had worked, and she'd actually plugged the hole. It wasn't perfect. She could still catch glimpses of the night sky through gaps in the vines, but it was far better than leaving the wound untended. I have not seen this thing before, Moira, Tigra called over his shoulder. You have made garden in the sky, big enough to fill stadium below. It is almost too much plant, but in this case, is good thing. It's big because the crystal was big. I just shaped it and asked it to help. Tigra laughed. Naira will be jealous. I doubt she has ever worked with crystal of such size. Good thing it was Tarim, or she'd chew my ear off. Moira watched the vines continuing to swell and bud overhead, feeling like her pride was doing the same thing inside her. After they landed, she'd be able to point up at the sky and say, See that? I did that. Well, with Tigra's help, obviously. I see fire down in stadium, Tigra announced. Moira was forced to grip him tighter as his slow glide turned into a dive. She was glad the glass of her face shield was still intact, or she'd have needed to squint against the rushing wind to see. Indeed, far below them, there were occasional large bursts of flame lighting up the stadium's central field. In rain like this, it had to be Alchemancy. We're coming, Moira thought. Again, her fur stood on end. This time, like someone had planted a hand on the back of her neck, then rubbed up towards her scalp. She glanced back at the spire. It was glowing vibrantly blue. Tigra, the spire's about to... Her warning was cut off as a bolt of lightning snaked through the air at a speed she couldn't track and took the big man in the side. Chapter 68. Children of Cyphus. Tazael ground his teeth, casting the spent Fyrum crystals aside and swapping for Electrum. He leapt through the wall of flames as they disappeared, cracking both crystals and slamming into a body 3 times stouter than his own. He brought the crystals to bear on Bradburn's skull, almost sliding them into his ears. Years of barely suppressed rage and hatred spilled out from Tazael in a bitter cry. Electricity bounced between his hands and through Bradburn's skull. There was enough backlash that Tazael felt his own body starting to lock up. That didn't matter. Bradburn was going to fry. Tazael's prism ran out. Unlike the stadium, which was still full of Bradburn's tainted fractal, the air out here was clean. Tazael had punched a sizable hole in the dome. but he'd underestimated how long it would take for Prism to diffuse into the bulb. Bradburn's skin was raw beneath Tazael's hands. He'd suffered severe facial burns, first from all the Fyrum, then now from the Electrum. The pads of Tazael's hands hurt from Electrum burns too, but there would be time for dealing with that after this murderer was dead. Bradburn fell back on his rump, causing a big splash in the mud. One oversized hand came up to clutch at his chest, while the other dug into his scalp. His breathing came in hitching gasps as his body struggled to remember how to breathe. Tazael's hands plunged into his pockets for more prism, when a set of fingers dug into his shoulder and yanked him backwards. Tazael spun, coming face to face with one of Bradburn's goons. The man was badly burned, too, but his eyes blazed with fractal. He seemed completely unfazed by his injuries. Great. Of course Bradburn had filled his closest personal security with the numbed. And this one had a knife. Curling his fingers around a prism canister, Tazael brought that hand out and punched the man square in his stupid snippered nose. The man recoiled from the strength of the blow, blinking only in surprise, not in pain. Then he snarled and came at Tazael with the knife. Time and again, Tazael leapt away, the knife only catching his Evo jacket. This thing had been custom made and cost a whole 50 Christum. Having anyone, much less a snepperd, carve gashes into the last thing he'd ever made with Ren just filled him with more fire. Eventually the man slipped in the mud. Tazael caught his wrist, driving his shin into the man's knee. The goon went down hard on that knee, but Tazael was in his face a moment later, forcing him to the ground. The knife hovered inches from the soft spot at the top of the man's sternum, quaking in both of the man's hands as Tazael put his whole weight into driving it down. Bringing the prism canister up to his mouth, Tazael bit down and inhaled. Then, continuing to lean into the man's arms, he pulled out an Aurum crystal. Cracking it in his grip, he brought his clenched fist down like a hammer. The Aurum burst slammed down, driving the knife in past the hilt. The man burbled in his own blood, fingers still clutching the knife's hilt uselessly. He may not have felt the pain of the wound, but the terror in his eyes said he knew he was dying. It was what he deserved. Gunshots rang out, and bullets took Tazael in the shoulder, side, and hip. Having just upped his prism, those brackers hurt. He crashed into the mud, then rolled to his feet. Standing brought pain when he tested weight on his injured hip. He didn't have time for pain. Wheeling, he turned to face the one who'd shot him. The man had a rifle and shone a Fyrum torch into Tazael's face. Tazael's hand plunged into his pockets for an Alchemancer crystal of any kind. He didn't care which. He didn't need it. A shorter female snep in a business suit, stained equally with mud and blood, leapt the man from behind. The woman would have looked familiar if she hadn't also looked so feral. Her claws were fully unsheathed, seeking out any unprotected skin she could find. Good. Let her distract the numbed. Tazael had bigger fish to fry. He'd only taken 2 steps towards Bradburn when another one of the numbed intercepted him, tackling him into the mud. The next few seconds brought Moira immense pain. Painful proximity to electricity that clenched her jaw so hard she might have broken a tooth. Painful ringing in her ears from the point-blank thunderclap. Pain from the shockwave that pried her from Tigra's back. They were both in freefall. Moira blinked quickly, trying to force her vision to unblur from the tears. When they did refocus, she saw Cyphus' central stadium rushing up to catch them. Below her, Tigra was falling like a rock, wind flapping around his unused gliding suit. Why wasn't he pulling up? He wasn't moving at all. Gritting her teeth, Moira tucked her arms to her sides and tapped into her own Aurum battery. She had to catch up to him, or they'd both splat in the next minute. Wind pushed against her from behind, giving her the necessary push to catch up to her friend. She gripped his suit with one hand, clinging on for dear life. "Tigra?" she called. No response. Wind continued to whistle around them as Moira tried to use her Aurum to slow them. It did slow them, but she couldn't reverse or even stop their fall. She needed Tigra conscious. "Seed Mother," she prayed, "don't let him be dead." Her Curum battery. Reaching around behind her suit, she felt for the release lever for her battery. She found one and pulled. Her connection to Aurum disappeared as the battery popped loose and fell away. Dross. She'd meant to release the Tarum. It took quite a bit of straining to hold on to Tigra and still reach the battery pocket on her leg. Her fingers teased the flap, brushing against the cold metal cylinder within. Come on. Come on. Finally, she got just enough of a grip to slide the battery out. It nearly came free entirely as she slid it from the pocket, but she pinched the end between her fingers with a death grip. Blindly, she felt behind her for the battery slot. It went in, she hoped, but she couldn't get it to lock into place. Wind continued to buffet them as the first skyscraper passed. Stupid thing, just latch! It seemed an eternity of falling before she felt the battery click into place. Slamming down the thumb button, she rammed her glove against Tigra's back and sang her heart out. They were less than 1,000 feet above ground when her prism tank ran empty. No, 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 not now. Beneath her, Tigra turned his head. Little Moira? Moira could have hugged him in relief, if they weren't plummeting like rocks from the sky. Tigra, we're falling! You have to save us! Right. One moment. Another rooftop neared, then passed. Still, they fell. Tigra? I'm sorry, Moira. I cannot feel hands or feet. If you don't, then we're gonna crash. I'm out of Aurum. Then use mine. I'm out of Prism, too. From her periphery, Moira could see their reflection in nearby windows as they plunged towards the open stadium. It's okay, Moira. I have Prism still. Just need Aurum. Fingers won't move. Okay. Okay. Digging her claws into his suit, Moira pulled herself arm over arm across his back. She glanced at the batteries on his back. Left side had the most reaction remaining, so she inched her way out onto his left arm. The suit material was tight out here, and her claws sank more into skin than suit. Tigra didn't complain, though, and this was absolutely an emergency. Less than 100 feet off the ground, she reached his wrist. She could see people below, and the falling pair zipped past the large lights ringing the stadium's inner circumference. She ignored them as she took his hand in her own, squeezing the thumb button with far more force than necessary. Aurum rushed from his palm, adding to the noise of wind around them. She clung to his arm, hugging it with her whole body as she screwed her eyes shut. If they were going to hit the ground, she didn't want to watch. Wind swept underneath them, and she felt their momentum slow. They hit the ground, but not hard enough to damage them further, just enough to splash them head to toe with mud. Every fiber of Moira's being was trembling, and she let out a laugh of disbelief. They'd survived. Gunshots sounded less than 100 feet away from where they'd landed. Moira flinched. There was still more survival to be done. Tigra, I'm going to go help the fight, but I'll be back for you as soon as I'm free. He chuckled, his face turned to the side so he wasn't nose first in the mud. Take spare tank, then. Told on me I would use it anyway. Don't worry, Tigra'll still be here when you return. Tazael chomped down into the numbed's throat. Seed Mother had given him a large Nulfin muzzle, and he was going to use every advantage he had. Claws raked across Tazael's stomach and chest, carving fire and unveiling hot blood. Still, he chomped harder, nearly gagging on the soggy fur. He didn't relish the taste of this man's blood, but it was a sign that this skirmish was nearly over. From the corner of his eye, Tazael watched the murderer pull something from his pocket. A small crystal with a deep violet hue. Bradburn snapped it between his hands like a concert-goer cracking a colored Fyram glow stick. Then, cupping it in his palms, he buried his nose in his hands. No! Tazael felt the rage inside boiling over, the muscles of his jaws finding newfound strength. His teeth sank deeper, and his mouth filled with blood. It coated his tongue, coated the roof of his mouth. All he could smell, and all he could taste right now, was Sneppard, and that infuriated him. He released the man beneath him, only to drive his fist into the Sneppard's skull once, twice, 3 times. There was a loud crack of thunder overhead as the man went still. Tazael staggered to his feet, blood leaking around his teeth to be lost in the rain. He stalked towards Bradburn, inhaling a prism canister and casting it aside. Cracking Firearm, Tazael bathed Bradburn in fire. Anyone else on the field was non-existent to Tazael. In that moment, there was only him and a man who deserved Anima's torments in Fanina forever. So Tazael poured on the flames. An enormous hand shot out of the inferno, clamping onto Tazael's wrist. The fur was singed to black, the skin beneath it a mixture of red and char. It twisted, torquing Tazael off balance. As the flames abated, the other hand launched forward, plowing into Tazael's gut with enough force to rupture organs. Tazael fought for breath as the next blow took him in the sternum, producing another crack. How? How was this monster still moving? How hard was it to barbecue a giant tomcat? As the rain replaced the fire and the smoke dissipated, Tazael could see that he had. The only recognizable parts of Bradburn at this point were his size and his scowl of loathing. Beyond that, he was horribly burned and disfigured. Yet his eyes were awash with fractal. I never should have let you out, Bradburn snarled. Twisting Tazael's arm further, he swung the other meaty arm in a wide arc before bringing his fist down like a hammer on Tazael's elbow. Tazael's arm buckled with explosive pain, and the strain on his shoulder felt like his arm was starting to tear away. With a cry of defiance and fury, Tazael used his free hand to tenderize Bradburn's partly cooked face. He got 3 blows in, the fur in his knuckles caking with blood and skin, before Bradburn caught that hand too. Bradburn squeezed, digging in his claws as he compacted Tazael's hand. It's over, Kit. End of the line. Like Fanina, it's over, Tazael thought. Tazael yanked on his own arms, not to get free, but to close the distance between him and Bradburn as he sank his teeth into the murderer's neck. Bradburn roared. Tazael's senses flooded with blood and death. Clawed fingers dug into the back of Tazael's neck, while more fingers clamped around his jaw. He tried to hold down the pressure, but Bradburn's strength was unnatural, and he ripped Tazael free, tossing him aside like a child discarding a toy that bored him. Tazael hit the mud, bouncing and sliding another few feet. So much of his battered body cried out for his attention, but he couldn't afford to calm down yet, couldn't afford to let up the pressure. He had to keep going before... Bradburn's wounds were healing. Tazael's bite had definitely drawn blood, but the puncture marks were no longer visible. By the time Tazael staggered back to his feet, even Bradburn's face was starting to shed patches of dead char. This bracker couldn't even die properly. Whatever special formula Dravota had concocted, that secret ingredient they'd used to change Tazael's father and restore his hand, Bradburn had saved a dose for himself. Tazael snorted, sending blood and rain from his nose. Well, if the man was going to heal, then Tazael could just burn him even longer. His fractured elbow nearly gave out as Tazael's hands plunged into his pockets and came away with the last of his Firearm crystals. He didn't count how many it was. He just grabbed them all, cracked them, and directed all his will at Bradburn. Tazael's hands screamed from the heat. They'd likely scar from this. He was desperate, though, and this needed to end now. A wall of fire nearly 10 feet across filled his vision. The fire didn't reach Bradburn. Somehow it ran up against a wall. Not a physical one, but one that was just as effective at holding it back. Through gaps in the flame, Tazael could see the fractal dancing in Bradburn's eyes, the smirk as the bracker exerted his own will on the firearm. Then the wall of flame was directed back at Tazael. The fire singed his fur and licked painfully at his skin. Tazael tried to push it back, but it was like arm wrestling with someone twice your size. You could tell when you were outmatched. Something else blindsided him, crashing into his side with the force of a car and flinging him over a dozen feet away. He bounced painfully twice, his fur collecting mud as he rolled. His tattered jacket was horribly marred, probably beyond recovery. His whole body ached, and the last thing he wanted to do was stand up again. Despite his ruined elbow and hand pads, stubbornness pushed him to his hands and feet anyway. Looking up to see what had hit him, he watched a small, snippered girl in a specially designed Alchemantic exosuit sail through the air to land beside him. Her eyes shone with prism against the rainy night, and a pair of batteries glowed on her back. Of all the people that could have saved his life, of course it was bracking squeakers. "You good, Soggy Fur?" she asked. She clapped a hand on his back, and he felt the familiar warmth of Curum surging into his weary body. Growling, he wiped an arm across his slick muzzle. "I'll live," he spat, though his body seemed to disagree. "Good, because we have a bad guy to take down." "To kill," Tazale emphasized. "Right." Squeakers didn't get it. Bradburn was far too dangerous to be left alive. While Bradburn lived, more people died. It was that simple. "I remember you," Bradburn said, rolling his neck while his face continued to heal. "You're the Dolahan brat who tried to chew me out in my own office." "Successfully chewed you out, you mean?" "That's not how I remember it." Moira shrugged. "Agree to disagree." Then she dropped her voice to a whisper. "Seed Mother, you're in bad shape. Can you stand?" "With help," Tazale admitted, though asking for her help left a worse taste in his mouth than all the Sneppard blood. Slipping under his arm, she continued pouring Curum into him. Together, they got Tazale to his feet, though it was an incredible struggle. "So, how do we take him down?" Moira whispered. Tazale shook his head. "At this point, he's just going to heal anything we do to him. I plan to use his own gun and shoot him in the head." "Okay," Moira said, sounding like a parent who's struggling to be patient. "That's certainly one option. I was hoping for something a little less lethal." "Either he dies, or we die, Squeakers." She groaned. "Don't tell me you're hurt too," Tazale said. "I know I won our fight earlier, but I didn't mess you up that badly, did I?" Moira rolled her eyes. "What hurts is realizing that you're probably right about killing him. And you did not win earlier. I kicked your rump so badly you ran off with your tail tucked between your legs." "Call it strategic retreat." "No, I call it running like a little kid because you were scared of a girl half your size." "I changed my mind," Tazale said, intentionally shifting more of his weight onto her. "Just let Bradburn kill me." "Breck you, man! I spent too much Curum on you just to let you die." "Breck you too, Squeakers." "Are you kits done bickering?" Bradburn roared around another clap of thunder. The burst of lightning backlit him, showcasing a face no longer marred by flame. The skin had healed over, though the fur that had been burned away hadn't grown back. "You ready for this?" Moira asked quietly. "Honestly, you can sit this one out if you need to. I won't judge you any more than I already do." Rubbing his nose to clear it, Tazale let out a hefty snort. "As ready as I'm going to be. Careful, though. He does the same dross you do, redirecting magic like a cheater." "It's not cheating," Moira hissed. "It's—" Tazale cut her off. "I could not give less of a dross what you want to call it, Kit. Point is, if we use Alchemancer on him, expect him to send it back at us with interest." "So we do what you did to me. Hit him with multiple elements at the same time so he can't deflect them all." "And then we shoot him." "Okay, Mr. Trigger Happy, don't get too ahead of yourself." By now, Bradburn had produced one of his guns. An odd design, and not the one that Tazale was used to seeing him murder people with. He clutched it calmly in front of him, with hands folded like some bouncer or otherwise respectable and respectful person. Nice of him to give them a chance to catch their breath. No, it wasn't that at all. It was simply a matter of confidence. Bradburn didn't view either of them as legitimate threats, so he would toy with them a little, kill them, then move on with his day. Tazale felt his blood beginning to boil again. "I go left, you go right." "Works for me," Moira said. Releasing each other, they sprang in opposite directions as more lightning crashed overhead. Moira used Aurum to add to her momentum. Bradburn stood there like a statue while she and Tazale circled him. What on Fanatom was he waiting for? His gun was already out. Shouldn't he be shooting at them right now? Blue electricity gathered around Tazale's palms as he leapt for Bradburn. At the same time, Moira tapped into the spare Aurum battery she'd taken off of Tigra, sending a buffeting blow for Bradburn's face. It struck him with the force of a punch, and his head swung away from the blow, but his focus was still on Tazale. Excuse me. As Tazale let out a burst of electrum, Bradburn stared him down. True, you didn't need motion to command magic, only prism. Motion, like singing, simply helped you with visualizing and communicating instructions to the magic. Like Tazale had warned, Moira watched as the electricity arced away from Bradburn and slammed into the ground around him instead. They tried the same thing again, Tazale tapping into electrum, Moira striking with aurum. Again, Bradburn willingly took the aurum hit and kept his focus on Tazale to avoid the electrum. This time, some of the electrum arced back into Tazale, who convulsed momentarily, spit, swore, and cracked more electrum. Moira was getting real tired of people not taking her seriously. Bradburn didn't think her aurum was worth worrying about. Time to give him a reason to worry. For this third attempt, Moira didn't gather just a modest amount of aurum. She kept the button on her glove depressed as she ran straight for Bradburn. Wind swept around her as she ran, lifting her off the ground. Bradburn turned his back on her entirely, charging straight for Tazale. Tazale unleashed his electrum, but again Bradburn sent it back, and this time Tazale took a knee. Moira rode the gust of wind all the way to Bradburn's shoulders. Then taking all the aurum she'd gathered up to this point, she focused it into a dense bubble centered on Bradburn's head. Her singing filled his ears with it, and the area around his head grew very cold as the pressure rapidly intensified. With what aurum remained, she flung herself backwards before releasing the microburst. The pop that followed rivaled the loudest of gunshots, and Moira's eyes watered in response. As for Bradburn, the living giant clutched at his head as blood poured from his ears. He staggered backwards, ears pinned to his head as if that would help. The man was lucky no brain matter had blown out of his ears. Tazale followed up with an electrum burst that sent Bradburn to his knees in the mud. Rain pounded both of them as Tazale grabbed for Bradburn's gun. They struggled over it, the elongated barrel waving straight into the air. Moira used aurum to throw several more concentrated strikes at Bradburn, but after the first few, he started deflecting them back at her and knocking her away from the fray. In the battle of wills, it seemed Tazale was Bradburn's equal, but in the battle of brute strength? Tazale fought every way he knew how to gain control of that gun, using punches, bites, alchemancy, anything to try to win the struggle. The struggle came to an abrupt end as Bradburn planted a foot into Tazale's gut and sent him sprawling backwards. Moira flung out with aurum, but Bradburn directed it elsewhere. Tazale had barely rolled up into a seated position when Bradburn shot him in the chest. Whatever came out of the gun punched through Tazale's jacket and embedded itself into his body. His arms flexed against the impact, but didn't buckle. He stared up at Bradburn, an expression of shock plastered on his face as the prism drained from Tazale's eyes. A dismissive kick from Bradburn laid Tazale flat in the mud. Moira flung more aurum in Bradburn's direction, but he deflected it with a thought as he popped his gun open and dumped something out. Was that a catalyst? It certainly loaded like one, as he reloaded it with a single crystal-tipped cartridge. Tazale wasn't getting up. She watched him fumble for more prism. When he bit into the canister, a hint of glow appeared in his eyes, but vanished as soon as he stopped sucking on the canister. It was the same as when the anima spawn drained you of prism. A moment later, Bradburn's foot smashed across Tazale's face. Turning away, Bradburn now aimed that gun at her. She could not get hit with that. Settling into a defensive crouch, she tried to decide her best approach for survival. If Bradburn only had one shot at a time, no wonder he'd waited to shoot. She just had to dodge the one shot, then she could attack him while he reloaded. Her legs tensed beneath her, and she started gathering aurum. A burst of gunfire echoed through the stadium. Bradburn's body recoiled as bullets took him in the leg, side, and arm. Moira spun to identify the shooter. Her mother knelt beside a fallen Bradburn soldier, rifle pressed to her shoulder, doing her best to fire in controlled bursts. She clearly wasn't used to firing a rifle, but she was close enough that she seemed to be hitting 1 out of every 4 or 5 rounds. The shooting was over in seconds as the rifle's ammo ran dry. Bradburn stood, still as a statue, while rain and blood washed through his fur. The gun hung in a loose grip at his side while he stared down at over half a dozen fresh bullet wounds. He took in one breath, then two. Moira's mother fumbled with the rifle, finally detaching the magazine while she searched the fallen soldier for one she could use to reload. Bradburn's gaze traveled to her, eyes burning with fractal and rage. With faster reaction time than seemed possible for a man of his size, he produced a second, more normal-looking gun from his jacket and fired 3 shots at Renetta. The first 2 hit her in the chest, the final one in the head. Blood ran down the bridge of her nose, spilling over either side of her muzzle as the rifle slipped from her fingers. Losing her balance, Moira's mother toppled backwards with a sickening squelch. Moira's mind blanked as the thing she feared most loomed overhead. She'd dodged it twice before. There would be no dodging it this time. Instinct took over, and Moira was already in motion before she even registered it. Kurum's song poured from her lips as she slid to a stop beside her mother. Moira felt the paralysis numbing its way into her brain. The Kurum would be too little, too late. Leo watched in horror as Renetta Dolahan collapsed not 50 feet from where he'd emerged. He'd burst through the door seconds too late. The last of the 13 had fallen. Bradburn had won. Moira rushed to her mother's side with a burst of Aurum so fluid it would have made Naira proud. If there was any hope at saving Renetta, it was with that girl. Unfortunately, Leo knew better. Bradburn was a good shot and wouldn't have missed at that distance. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head, like any trained officer worth his firearm certification. She'd be dead in seconds. All that remained was to prevent further death in the family. Bradburn lowered his Steris 55, instead aiming a different handgun at the back of Moira's head. Like Fanina, Leo drew his Edwest 38 and fired. A pair of bullets took Bradburn in the wrist, and his strange gun fell to the mud with an unnoticed splash. "It's over, Bradburn! Stand down!" Bradburn turned to regard him, blood pouring from several bullet wounds in his body, his eyes alight with the very thing he'd made his scapegoat. His voice boomed over the rain. "Parsons, I thought I told you to always go for the head." Bradburn raised the Steris, but another 2 shots from Leo tore through his knuckles, and it fell to the mud too. "You're under arrest, Bradburn," Leo barked, gun trained on Bradburn's center of mass as Leo advanced. "Arresting me does nothing except annoy me, Parsons," Bradburn said, holding his arms out in a dramatic gesture and leaving his guns behind as he walked to meet Leo. "You don't have the jurisdiction. I am the law now." "You're a usurper and a tyrant, but you are not the law. Not while I have breath to say anything about it." "Then you better shoot me before I reach you, Parsons, or I will kill you." Shaking his head, Leo said, "I'm not playing by your rules, Bradburn." Now it was Bradburn's turn to shake his head. His ears sagged, rain and blood running down his face. "I'm disappointed in you, Parsons. You're too short-sighted to see the bigger picture, and you don't have the guts to do the hard things that have to be done. That's why you're going to die." With a snarl, Bradburn sprang straight for him. "Sorry, dearest," Renetta whispered with immense effort. Moira hardly heard it with how loudly Kurum's song burst from her mouthpiece. Desperately, she clutched for any snippet of her mother's song that she could still hear, pleading with the Kurum to latch onto it and strengthen it. It was a losing battle. The life was fading from her mother's eyes, and Moira felt like someone had plunged a knife into her own chest. Her eyes blurred with rain and tears. They'd survived so much together. They still had a whole mess of a world to straighten out. She'd finally gotten her mother back. To lose her at the very end would make everything pointless. And yet there was nothing Moira could do. She was fated to lose the people she loved most. A burst of wind ruffled Moira's fur, blasting raindrops in all directions. She hardly noticed. Her world was collapsing, and this time it was going to destroy her for good. Black-furred fingers slid a crystal into Moira's trembling fingers. They took her fingers gently, working with them to crack the crystal. Deep, violet light spilled through the gaps between her fingers. A warm voice, a comforting voice, broke through the darkness. It was probably the only voice that could have reached her at this point. Combine your mother's song with this crystal, Nyra said. Then sing with everything you have left.